afternoon and welcome to Scenery Development, Obstacles and Delays. I'm Alex Goff and
I am Misha Taich.
We are both from Orbx Simulation Systems, and we're here to talk to you this afternoon about some of the obstacles and issues you may run into in scenery development, along with how to start a project and, more importantly, how to finish a project.
So you can bet there are a lot of them. So
there are.
There are a lot of common obstacles that you'll come across, and unless you really focus yourself and make sure that you've got all of the tips to finish a project, it's very easy to get sidetracked and never finish.
So some background about ourselves. You want to go first?
Okay, so I have been developing for about 4 years now. I first started out at OzX as a freeware developer. Prior to that, I didn't have any knowledge of developing at all. But I basically worked through it very hard, and at this point, I've released 8 commercial projects, 7 of them through Orbx. And notable projects that I've released through Orbx include Lake Tahoe, Sonoma County. We've got Dubrovnik upcoming as well. And also another exciting airport that I shall be announcing at the end of this talk.
So stick around, there's a little bit of bonus at the end. So again, I'm Alex Goff. I've been at Orbx for 5 years now, just a little bit over. I've done 9 commercial airport projects, and I've contributed to handful of regions as well. So my notable projects, the one that people probably most know would be Meigs Field, the FS Classic. So I've also done Bar Harbor, which is in Maine, released about a week and a half ago, and Homer and Yakutat, which are both in Alaska. So we're gonna show a little bit of the progress that we've had over the years. So we both started out doing freeware projects as a hobby. And so mine was originally a glider strip in Washington, and that was about 6 years ago, 5-6 years ago. And more recently, Meigs Field, so kind of a little timeline of progression and how developing goes. So
Alex's first project looks a lot better than most first projects. So here's mine. As you can see, it looks a lot worse than his first one. And that's my latest one here.
And so a lot better than my latest one.
So I'd just like to point this out in particular because it really goes to show that it's not really as daunting as people may think. So people might think, oh, I need 10 years to get up to a really good standard of projects. But really, if you really dedicate and put yourself towards it, you should always be getting tips from other developers. That's one of the best things that I can advise. The first person that I ever contacted from Orbx to get tips was actually Alex back in 2012, and he's pretty much the one that gave me the start. And you really don't need to be developing for 10 years or 20 years as some people have, just to get to a good standard. It really, if you dedicate yourself to it, you can get so much done. So start on what we're going to be going over this afternoon. So we're here to talk to both beginning and more experienced developers with tips and insights from our own projects, which are by no means an exhaustive list or an exclusive list of tips to follow, but just things that we have noticed over the past 5 years or so that help projects move along faster, help us start them, and help from getting stuck in roadblocks or pitfalls. Also talk about some very flight simulation specific project management. So project management is pretty well detailed if you go to business school or a lot of school really. You'll learn a lot about it, but so we're gonna try and focus on some flight simulation aspects of it. Some ideas for how to pick your projects and how to get them started. Getting your project started and getting your project finished are really the hardest parts. It's easy to look at airports and think about them, but it's oftentimes hard to commit and then commit all the way through. And then at the end, we're going to talk about some resources for helping in your development, some things that you
will want before you start on a project.
And all these things aren't just things that we have seen from other developers. So often all these tips basically come from seeing other developers try and fail to deliver a project. But not only that, these are all also from our own personal experiences. Right now, I am working on a project and I still suffer some of these pitfalls. So I'm sort of taking my own advice here.
Yeah, so do as we say, not necessarily as we do all the
Yeah.
time. So we're kind of in two categories. We're going to go over picking projects and then managing the project after you've selected it.
Okay, so one very important thing that you need to have when you're picking a project is a desire to actually develop that specific airport. So you have to actually make sure you pick something that you want to develop. If you pick something solely based off demand or solely based off someone that said, oh, can you make this project please, please, come on, please, you know, then you won't necessarily enjoy it. It might be a project which once you see it suggested, you'll be interested in. So for example, I never saw myself creating Sonoma County Regional Airport, but it got suggested, and then once I started actually looking into it, I actually got quite interested in the airport. And so that's why I did it. But let's say you're just starting out as a developer. You really don't want to be doing LAX.
And we'll get to that later about sizing things.
Yeah, but you know, because you really just won't enjoy it at all. It'll be more of a chore than something that will really bring you enjoyment. And when you're starting out as a developer, then you really want it just to be as a hobby, and you know, you don't want to dive straight into the commercial aspect of it, because otherwise
You'll burn out fast and it won't be
Exactly.
enjoyable. So the first piece of advice I have is don't go home. So what that means is generally when people first get involved in developing and making their own things is sort of inspired by how awful your home airport looks, how inaccurate it is, how barren it is, doesn't feel right. And so a lot of people do get involved that way, is to try and improve their own area. But so for a larger project, it can be a bit dangerous to do something you know well, because oftentimes you can get caught up in the details of it, and it really ends up in a vicious cycle of wanting to add more and more so that your home feels right. And that's not to say that doing your home airport there's anything wrong with it. It's just that you're in much more danger of getting carried away with what you're doing and kind of losing sight of the bigger details, and it turns into a 1 year, 2 year, 3 year project. And which on its own, that's not necessarily bad if you're developing as a hobby, or if you just really want to see your home airport better, then that's perfectly fine. On a commercial scale, it can be not as good because you'll spend a lot more time, and oftentimes others won't necessarily understand the details you put in or why it's there or even see them in the first place. So instead, I mean, of course, pick somewhere that's interesting. That goes back to Misha's desire to develop. But picking somewhere that you've never been can be even more interesting. You get very familiar with it. So really just picking an interesting location, interesting airport, something that has an interesting feature or difference about it that really catches your eye is another really good way to get started without sort of the danger of ending up in a 4-year-long project because you're working on every single detail of your home airport.
All right, so now going back to project scale and what I said about LAX, if you're just starting out as a developer, then you really don't want to be picking a large international airport as your first project. And I'm not even talking about someone who might have previous experience in games design, like me, but I'm talking about someone who actually has no knowledge at all when they're first starting out, just like I did. I could barely even use a brush in Photoshop when I started out. So you really want to pick a small to medium-sized airfield as your first project, because that way it's a lot harder to burn out. There's less to do, and it allows you to focus more on the details instead of, if you start getting into a large international airport and you start it's basically like a small airport times 10. You've got huge buildings and you've got a massive amount of details. So if you realistically wanted to, starting out, if you realistically wanted to complete a large airport, in the same amount of time as it would take for a small project, then you won't end up with a great quality product. So as a new developer, as I said, there's a great deal to learn, and a mega airport isn't a good debut project because you will likely never finish it. And going to knowledge, the in-depth knowledge to actually develop a mega airport comes with experience. That's all it takes, experience. You can't dive straight into a mega airport and expect to finish it at a great quality if you don't have the experience for that. A smaller airport should also allow you to better see if you're actually interested in pursuing development. If you start with a larger airport, then what you'll find happening is that you will be working more on the worst parts of the airport than the better parts of it. So if you start with an international airport plus a huge area around the airport, what you find yourself doing is the boring tasks, like autogen and all that stuff. So if you're doing a smaller airport, then you won't burn out as quickly. That's a very easy thing to do when you're first starting out, is to burn out and to basically just think to yourself, oh, this is way too hard and it's not for me. So if you do a smaller airport, then that's the starting point. From the small airport, you can build up. You can go from a grass strip to a paved runway, a small GA airport. You can start going into regional, eventually go into mega airports. But if you go straight into the mega airport, then you'll find that you'll just think it's too hard. And straight off,
So burnout is really what we are trying to prevent here, because burnout is very common in every form of development, and it is what will kill your enthusiasm for it. So now we're going to do the project management portion, so some flight simulation specific project management tips, along with some sort of more generalized software development management tips. Airport development. So generally, I found that doing the exciting things first in a project is very tempting. That's of course why you pick the project to do that one cool building or put in this one cool area of the airport. But what that leaves you with is, after you've had your fun, you've made something really cool, you'll either end up going back to that piece and continuing to work on it, or you'll be faced with the task of doing all the very boring and mundane parts of an airport, and that can be overwhelming. And it can really drag things out, whereas if you put the worst parts first, the most boring parts, then you'll have something to look forward to, and honestly, the project will go by faster. So I've switched my own development methods to that after a long time of doing the exciting thing first and then dragging it out, finishing up the details. Get the details done first. So for example, if you have a large area around your airport where you have to place trees, autogen, take care of that first. Put in all the boring trees, spend your 3 days just sitting there clicking on trees and placing them. And once you're done with that, you have the airport to look forward to, and it's going to be surrounded by beautiful vegetation and houses, and it'll fit naturally and more closely resemble what the end product is like.
And often the result of the most boring bits is the most spectacular.
Yeah, that's the beautiful landscapes covered in trees with your aerial imagery processed and complete. And then once you've got that, that's your backdrop for your airport, which you'll get to see the entire time that you're developing. So to give some example to this, I included a screenshot of my own tree placement. So that's a tiny portion of like 800 square kilometers of trees. And this can take weeks, months to place. But in the end, you've completed the boring thing first, and you're no longer faced with doing that at the end of your project when you most want to get rid of it, and you least want to go back to the things that are dreadfully boring and make very little visual impact, but must be done anyway.
Now, one of the main things...
Most dangerous.
Most dangerous, absolutely. Feature creep. Feature creep is exactly that. It will creep up on you and it will drag you down every single time. So, the definition is the tendency of a design project to just accumulate more and more details. You think to yourself, you look at And this is most dangerous when you actually have photos of the real airport. When you don't have photos and you're kind of making stuff up, then you can draw your own mental line as to how much detail you want. But when you've got photos, then what will happen is you'll look at your photos and you'll say, I want to include that bin, I want to include that dumpster, I want to include that building, and perpetually it'll just extend. And what you also might find is that you learn new technologies as you're developing that airport. You're going to want to include those then. So when that happens, the result is that you most likely won't actually ever complete your project. And in the end, it sort of makes it all for nothing. So avoiding the feature creep is no matter the size of the airport, you're always going to have a new detail to add. So, this blade of grass might not be rotated the right direction. There's always a new detail that you can add in. So the larger the airport is, the more feature creep poses a threat. Because obviously the larger the area, the more things there is to creep up on you. And the best way to tackle it is to know from the very start exactly what you'll be putting in. Make a plan, actually know what you're going to be including and what you won't be including. Now obviously, that can't always be possible because a project can take months. And over a few months, you might find you're learning new stuff that you really do have to include. But you need to draw the line somewhere, absolutely. So
I have an example for this. So
yes.
When I start an airport project, and especially if I'm going to take photos of it, one thing that I do is get an aerial image, go to Google Earth, and I label each and every building that I'm going to model, assign them a number, and stick to that. Because it's very easy to say, I'll just build everything in this area, but at some point you have to figure out where do we draw the line between spending time modeling it and actually working on a completely custom building and using a more generic building to fill something farther from the airport. So I find that really making a list of every single thing you're going to model and trying to stick to that, only adding things when it seems very important. For example, if it's easily visible from the runway or something, you can add that to the list because that's an important feature of the airport and easily visible to users. But so keeping the list is very important. Keeping a master list of your development and where you are in it and looking at it so you can see, I'm this far into the project and I've done this, I will do this, and at the end, if you have time, add in little things, add in more things. Your project will definitely change as you develop it, but it's important to try and lock it down to a certain set of features. No change?
Yeah, it's great to have fellow developers that you can actually share your project with, and the fellow developers can actually tell you where you need to draw the line. So, for example, I have one particular person that I talk to who shall not be named, but which some people might know, that I talk to, and he's the main one that, I'll show him something, and he says, are you sure you need to do that? And I think for a bit, and I say, no, I don't really need to do that. So, for example, for Sonoma County, I had this entire area of industrial buildings that I was thinking, I'm going to model all of that because I like it to look as realistic as possible. And then I basically tell that to the fellow developer, and he says, but do you really need to do that? You could just put the autogen and be done with it. It should look just fine. And you sort of think to yourself, you're sort of split now. On one hand, you're just like, I really want that detail, but on the other hand, you say, I'll save a lot of time by just doing what he says. And so I thought to myself, no, I don't need to model them. I put the autogen down, I look at it in the simulator, it looks great. It looks just as good as it needs to look.
Yeah, and a lot of times, if you do opt to take a shorter development path, if you opt to use a generic building instead of modeling something, you'll know very quickly if it looks out of place and it looks too generic for where you are. You'll know very quickly if you need to spend that extra time on it because you're going to be spending so much time looking around your project, the parts that are bland or out of place will be very apparent to you. So I had some common feature creeps that I can go over. So new techniques and technology. So it's always fun to implement something new in a project. And I really try and do it at the very start. So have 1 or 2 or 3 fun new things you want to put into your project and try and get those in at the start because after you've started on a project and you're well into it, implementing something new that you've learned or new technique or some new piece of technology becomes available to you, it can be very cumbersome. You oftentimes may have to rework other things to fit into this new thing that you have added. And it causes a lot more delays than doing it at the very start when your project is fluid and flexible and you can easily put something new in and adapt everything else to it. What I call stopping the clock. So airports change, they change a lot. In developing, I've learned exactly how much they change. And it's important to pick a date and time that your project will represent and not do anything forward. If they put in a new taxiway, that's already happened. Your project is already locked in to June 2016. You have to cut the line somewhere, because what can happen is you will spend more time adding in this new addition to the airport, the new hangar in the GA section, or the change in runway stripes. And that will start the cycle of building your project length up. And then if you commit yourself to making every single change that the real world airport undergoes, as your project goes on longer, you will keep putting more and more changes in, because more will happen as your project is dragging out.
And you'll have a lot of people in the community asking you, can you include this? And can you include this? This new hangar's shown up. Can you please update your scenery? And you still really have to draw a line. There's not much point in going back to your old scenery and updating it, unless it's a very, very major upgrade. Like there's an entire new terminal an entire terminal has been demolished and a new one's been built. If it's very small changes, there really isn't much point in you spending your time doing those changes. Your time is spent a lot better investing into new projects.
So then, going back to, Misha was sort of talking about this feature creep, expanding in physical scope. So you really need to define what area are you covering in your project. Are you just inside the airport fence enhancing it? Are you the airport fence and the surrounding areas? Are you all the way out to the town, the next town, all the way out 50 miles in each direction? You really have to decide, because at some point you do have to transition back to what default FSX provides or your platform, and draw the lines of your project. Because as you expand your project, really it adds a much larger load each time you make it larger than you'd expect. You have to put down houses and trees, and you have to work with the terrain again, and it adds a load. So really lock down your area at the start. By the time you commit to a project, you should really have it in your head, this is how big it's going to be, and no larger.
Going back to that, a good rule to follow is don't have your photoreal scenery area around the airport extend much further than you can actually see. So if you can, from the airport, if you can see a distant mountain range, then it'll be good to include that, because it's one of the things that will bring much more immersion. But let's say you've got a coastal airport right on the coast, and all you can see is basically a mountain range rising up straight next to the airport. You've got the coast there and a mountain range right on the coast. Then, especially if you're just starting out, a good rule to follow is just to end your photoreal area on the other side of that mountain range, because that's all that people can see from the airport.
And yeah, so a good example to tie that in, I mentioned before, I worked on Meeks Field with another developer, Tim Harris, and our original plan, and this goes into feature creep, scope creep, physical size. Our original plan was that it would be just the airfield. If you're familiar with Meeks Field, which I think most of us here are, intimately familiar, it is on a little peninsula, a little funny shaped peninsula. So we thought it'll just be the peninsula, it'll be historic, it'll be cool, it'll be done. But then you're sort of faced with, well, off in the distance is the city, and it's actually not really in the distance, it's right on top of you. And so you're faced with that doesn't look good anymore, and it's contrasting with the beautiful airport that you've spent so much time working on. So picking things like that are in the range of vision for your users, and where they'll be seeing on approach, departure, those are the areas that you should make sure to include in your scope. And when you're flying patterns around your airport, as every good developer should, oh, did we fall asleep? Yeah, so when you're exploring your project and checking it out, you'll see these areas. You'll see, oh, that looks terrible. I need to make sure it's in my project so I can improve it and it's not contrasting with the other areas I've been working on.
So building momentum, keeping up your momentum and work ethic is crucial. I think everybody can really relate to that in some way or another. In your jobs, you have to keep moving, you can't stop and burn out, and it's important to build and keep your momentum. So we find setting a mental goal of what you're going to do on that day. The most productive days aren't generally the ones where you just sit down and do something. Those can be the most fun days. Those can be the days where you start something new that you never really expected. But if you have a project going and you're working on it, sitting down with a goal in mind, going back to I keep a list of what's on my project and it's roughly in chronological order, it's very easy to see today I will be doing this and that's all I'm doing today. But yeah, then after that, honestly sit down and start. If you run into issues, Google them, consult somebody, but keep working.
Yeah, find what works for you. So I find I am most productive when I have a YouTube video of some 1 hour comedy special on in the background. I'm listening to that, and since I don't have to switch back to the internet to basically just change that, it's just an hour long, I basically just spend that entire hour working, and I'm in a good mood because I'm actually listening to something funny. So, you know, find something that works for you. You find that listening to music helps you with productivity. You might find that complete quiet helps with productivity. But the main thing is just do not allow yourself to be distracted. It's very easy with all the other programs on the computer, especially if you're doing something boring, like AutoGen. It's very easy to get distracted by something, and you'll find that you'll say, oh, I'll just switch to this for 5 minutes and then go back to developing. That 5 minutes will turn into 5 weeks of doing nothing.
And so taking short breaks ties into that. It's important to make sure you give yourself a break. Everyone knows, take little breaks when you're working so you don't burn out while you're working, and that's important.
But you know, if you can work non-stop without burning out, then that's all the power to you.
Yeah, by all means, go ahead.
Do it.
And one thing I didn't write down on here, coffee. I am a big fan of coffee at work, so I think everybody can relate there.
That's not that. We don't condone that.
Oh, I condone it.
No, you don't. More isn't always better. If you're a new developer, it's a lot better to just stick to one project. I find it's far too common, especially on FS Developer, that people are working on multiple projects at once. And especially if you're a new developer, it isn't really a great idea because you'll find that if you begin multiple projects and start to work on basically just more than one thing at a time, it'll just add to your stress, extend development times, you'll burn out a lot more quickly. Now obviously, if you've got experience, so let's say you're a very experienced developer, you've got multiple commercial projects out, you've got a reputation, then it's not, I mean, it really depends on who you are. So if you find that you can work on multiple projects at once, then, you know, by all means go ahead, but I find most people won't actually finish anything on time or by a deadline, usually a personally set deadline, if they work on more than one project at once. So let's say at the moment I have a major project that I'm working on, and I also have a side project which I'm collaborating on with another developer, that is Dubrovnik. In that case it's okay because you're not bearing the full brunt of both projects. On one you're doing everything, and on the other one you're only doing part of it. The most major parts are left to someone else. But I recommend, if you're a new developer, just stick to the one airport. It's the best thing to do. Just see it through till the end. It's much more satisfying to see a project through all the way to the end, your first project, than it is to be working on multiple ones. It just adds to your stress, perpetually extends development times, and you know, it ultimately means you'll really never get it out. And that, getting a project out, especially your first one, is probably one of the most satisfying things when you're developing.
Okay, so we're going to go over some of the resources that you should have when you're starting a project. So we're kind of operating on the assumption that you're going to work on airports. So that's what we're targeting here. Really, the first and most important thing that you really absolutely need if you're going to commit to
going through an airport start to finish is aerial imagery. So not all areas of the world are equally covered. Aerial mapping is not necessarily fair. A lot of areas have great coverage and multiple sources, and a lot of areas have absolutely nothing in terms of aerial imagery. So really picking an area that has good availability will make your life easier. Fighting against poor quality aerial imagery in your project will hurt it in the long run. It will just never have the visual fidelity that you would otherwise have. So try and make that the first area. Kind of recommend naturally colored aerial imagery. You'll know if it's naturally colored because otherwise it'll be bright red or horrible green. And it's easier to work with it if it's already got a semblance of natural color. And higher resolution, 60 centimeters per pixel is sort of the minimum I would start to consider for an airport. 30 centimeters is a really good resolution. That means each pixel on the ground is that big or so. And that's where you start to get the very good quality in there.
And 7 centimeter is a gold mine.
And that's the highest that the Microsoft and Lockheed platforms can display, so that's what you're aiming for. But yeah, so as you gain experience, if you start working on multiple projects and processing photoreal multiple times and do it a lot, you'll gain the experience you need to you can start to work with more complex imagery that may not be as beautiful at the start. It requires some tweaking and massaging to get it to appear nice. Maybe it has an enormous cloud sitting on something that you have to learn to clone brush out, or maybe the coloration is terrible and you're going to have to spend a lot of time working on those color sliders to get it to look natural.
Probably one of the most frustrating things is not being able to recolor the imagery exactly how you would like it.
So as a new developer, aerial imagery is oftentimes expensive and inaccessible, but there are a lot of public domain sources. At the same time as being inaccessible and expensive, it is also very cheap and very, very easy to find. So the entire United States is covered by the US Geological Survey in varying degrees of resolution. Some of it won't be worth anything, some of it will be amazing quality that you wonder why aren't they charging for this. And also local authorities oftentimes have imagery. Most governments have some form of a GIS office where you can either search online or request that they mail you imagery to use in your project. Imagery on Google Earth or Bing is not free to use in a commercial project. That's a dangerous hole to fall down. In your own projects at home, it is fair use. So if you are working on your own, doing your own thing, if you don't have intent to distribute it commercially or otherwise, then it's fine to use, and oftentimes a really great source. And it's really great because it's really expensive to use commercially. But yeah, so aerial imagery, very important in picking your project. It's really what sets it up.
Yeah, so I'm assuming most people here are from the United States, and so if you're interested in starting development, the United States is definitely one of the best places to find that free aerial imagery. The USGS has some absolutely amazing quality stuff on it, and you know, if you find that, it's definitely very lucky. So if it's your first project, you really want to start with that. Start with very nicely colored imagery that's already like naturally well colored. It's sharp. You really don't want to be starting with grayed out imagery that's a very bad resolution. Although, as Alex said, once you start gaining experience, then you will be able to work with stuff like that and make it into something usable and nice to look at in the simulator. So on-site photography is probably almost as important as aerial imagery. It's not absolutely necessary, depending on the airport size, it's not absolutely necessary, but if you're working with a smaller airport, you'll find that usually smaller airports tend to have the same sort of stuff at them, and so you can sort of make stuff up without any photos, or you can have photos from the internet which aren't necessarily the best for texture work.
But they're good for reference.
They're good for reference, so you can make your own textures. Smaller GA airports are generally the easiest places to get on-site photography. As a very good example of this, back in February when I visited California to photograph my current project, DeAndre and I photographed 2 airports. The first one was the main one, which is a regional-sized airport. Now, when we went there, we had major problems. The management was quite interested in basically just charging us quite a lot just to be able to take photos of the airport. They seem to be very strict about taking photos of the airport. And you'll find it's a lot harder, especially at a mid-sized airport, to do that. However, after that, we went to a smaller airport to take photos. Basically just a small GA one. It's you know, in a local community, everyone's got their own hangar. And there, I just went up to the FBO and I told them what I was doing, taking photos for a FlightSim project, and they said, go ahead, walk over the apron, you can even go onto the active runway, it's fine. So, yeah, I didn't go onto the active runway. I went close to it, but yeah, not quite onto it. But yeah, so that's pretty much the difference. And there at that airport, I walked wherever I wanted, you know, took photos of everything. And that's really the difference. So at a small GA airport, you'll find it's generally far easier to get photography. Lighting conditions are very important when it comes to taking photos. So if you're basically taking textures straight from photos and putting them onto a model, your best bet is a cloudy day where you don't have sharp shadows. But you also don't want to be too dark, otherwise you lose definition. So extensive, well-lit on-site photography should be very helpful in not only making the models as accurate as possible and having all their details there, but it will shorten your project timeline because you'll spend much less time online looking for photos of the airport. I found this to be a major problem when I was doing Sonoma County. I got someone in California to go and take photos for me, but once again the airport refused access, and so they could only take a very limited number of shots. And I found myself working mostly off photos that I found off the internet, and researching that and finding photos of specific areas which I didn't know, you know, what they looked like, took up a major part of my time. So if you have on-site photography, it's far easier because you already have the reference there, you know exactly where everything is. In the absolute best case scenario, you should get on-site photography and you are the photographer, because what you'll find then is not only do you have reference, but you are actually there and know where everything is. And so once you develop the airport, you'll have the best sort of spatial awareness of it, and it'll be a lot easier to, you know what will look right and what will look wrong, basically. And as I said, when we're visiting an airport, try to take the photos on, don't try to take airports, try to take photos. Airport photos on overcast day. You have less shadows, and shadows, yeah, they'll be less harsh. Yeah, during your visit, try and acquire a master plan if it's available online, so you know where everything is. You'll find that the hardest thing to get photos of is taxiway signs, and so for that you'll be mostly relying on the master plans of the airport to sort of create those yourself.
So yeah, so that is project management and scenery development and delays in general. So we're going to open it up for questions now if anybody's interested. Yes?
How do you avoid ending up with a beautifully complex project that will only run on a supercomputer?
Yeah, so optimization is an area that I think everybody in development kind of struggles with at times. You want your airport to be beautiful, gorgeous. You want to have the highest resolution textures. But oftentimes, at the end of your project is when you should be optimizing. Don't optimize as you go, because then you're not really optimizing because you don't know how the end result will be. But yeah, it's really all about optimization. So at the end, you'll be able to see if I shrink my textures down, will it hurt the visual appeal of my airport? Or if I lighten up the load on grass, will it make a difference or will it make it feel barren? So really, it's all about at the end of your project, that's when you should be optimizing and making sure that your beautiful creation can actually run on somebody else's computer so they can see it also.
Optimization is certainly something which also comes with experience over multiple projects. So that's also going back to the size of the project. That's why it's good to start with a small airport, because then you don't have as much experience optimizing, and a small airport will be less likely to hurt performance than a larger airport. But yeah, I reckon the best way to learn about optimization is just talk to fellow developers, because when you do that, you know, they'll know a lot more about it. Yeah.
There are a lot of proven techniques out there. You just have to ask people who know them.
Exactly.
So do you have a system spec in mind that your targets to work on?
Not necessarily. I mean, so you gauge it on your own system and your tester systems. You should really make sure that a variety of different systems are put through the test, so you can kind of see where does it start to struggle, sort of what level is it going to start breaking down, and you really need to start targeting those lower ends with either options for users or optimizing further. So there's not really a target system in mind. Kind of, I guess, try and get an idea of what most people seem to be using at the current time. So like, most people have either an i5 or an i7 and a decent graphics card. And so you kind of just have to figure out what system is sort of the average at the time. Make sure that you've got an idea of where your system that you're developing on compares to the majority of your users, because for instance, if you're running a really low-end system, you may be neglecting to put in features that many users could run because they have higher end, or if you have a really high-end system, absolutely amazing, when somebody else gets it who's playing on a laptop or something, it's going to be terrible. So it's really important to get a frame of reference for your own system. So yeah, so there's not really a target. It's really, I guess, a moving target more than anything, because you know, systems are fluid, people upgrade, it changes.
At the end of the day, most ideally, you want to develop an airport and apply everything you know about optimization to it, so that it performs as well as possible. So in my mind, I'm not thinking of a particular system. I'm just thinking of the worst system that someone may be able to use this on, and I want it to run well on the worst system.
So would you not just have that by having a setup? So you have both types of development.
Yeah, well, that's where a control
The user defines how detailed it's going to be.
Yeah, exactly. Well, that's where control panels come really in handy, because you know, you can get people can pretty much select what they want on and what they want off. But you know, it's actually very surprising how much detail you can pack into the sim and not have much of a performance impact.
And so that's also why having testers with a variety of systems is important, because as developers, you may not want to maintain 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 different systems just to test. You may have your desktop and a laptop, maybe your old rig that you can test on. But so having a variety of testers, get a dozen people who have systems across all ranges, some of them on laptops, some of them on older systems, some of them on the newest thing. So that's really where that comes in. Ooh, whose hand was up first?
Do you do anything with compatibility with other vendors' products? Or
yeah, so I'd say that also is something that you generally do at the end of your project. So throughout your project, keep an awareness of who else is in your area, who else has projects around you, so you can kind of get an idea if what you need to do, what you need to target. And then at the end of your project, when you're going through testing and optimization, that's when you really target other vendors' products and be able to work with them and implement the compatibility you need in your project. So, yes, in front.
It's a scenery products don't care for 64-bit, so you don't have to like redo or develop scenery.
It's hard to say right now. It's really hard a 64-bit simulator to look at. I mean,
we haven't got a 64-bit simulator to actually look at.
Things like texture files do not care what system they're on, as long as the platform can read them. But don't really know for other assets. I mean, it's totally possible that they could be, but it's also possible they couldn't. So until we've really got that 64-bit,
we won't know until it comes out.
Well, I thought the 64-bit SDKs are already out.
Oh, so those don't actually apply to 64-bit platforms. It's rather for...
yeah, so basically the 64-bit SDKs, they only actually give the tools for 64-bit programs, like 3D Studio Max.
So the tools you're working with are 64-bit, but it's still compiling and targeting a 32-bit
Okay, okay, that was my question. So it's like, you know, like let's say a scenery, like the Sonoma, right? You compiled it to 32.
Yeah.
Is it just a matter of compiling it to 64-bit and you're good?
Yeah.
Well, we don't really know.
We can't say.
we won't know until we get there. It's all nobody really knows yet.
I hope so.
In the back?
Me?
Yes.
So when developing for multiple simulator platforms, what's a good plan to, like a mental plan to have in your mind to finish?
I mean, start with one platform. So
Yeah.
I find it's good to stick to one platform. I still use FSX as my main platform throughout development, and then at particular steps throughout development, I put it into P3D to see how it looks. And then at the very end of the project, I've completed every single thing in FSX. I put it over into P3D and just shift anything that needs to be fixed.
Yeah, so start with one and then branch at the end. So you can either go with the one school of thought, which would be start in FSX and then add features for prepared, or more recently I've started working in prepared more exclusively and then sort of backporting it to FSX because it's a lot easier to remove features than it is to add things in. But yeah, so
Okay.
one and branch.
So what about like developing in the FSX prepared and then moving on to X-Plane?
We don't do
We don't do
X-Plane, so we don't
No
really have
idea.
much advice there.
Okay.
I mean, hold on to your
X-Plane
source
is
files.
X-Plane's a different beast.
Yeah, hold on to your
It's very
source
different.
files and use those in your new project. It's the source files you want. So
Yeah.
Okay.
We'll take one more question.
Is Orbx moving to the northeast to do regional coverage?
there are no regions planned at the moment in the Northeast. John's back there, and after you can catch him and ask him more. But
If anyone has a question about like the actual talk.
But yeah, so I personally had developed an airport in the Northeast, Bar Harbor, Maine. So that's sort of it's on its own. It's considered a global airport because there is no region for it. I personally definitely have a lot of interest in the Northeast, so we'll see where that goes. Did anybody have one last quick question?
Do you guys ever have any difficulty moving from FSX to FSX Scene Edition?
They're identical pretty much.
Yeah, in terms of scenery, it really is functionally identical.
Yeah.
So, I mean, as long as your installers can locate it correctly, you're really fine.
Yeah. Okay, if anyone has any more questions, we're out there. Feel free to come up to us and ask away.
Misha has one last thing that I think he'd like to show.
Yes. Okay, and I would, DeAndre and I went to photograph, and that is Santa Barbara in Southern California. So if you would like to see more of it, we have exclusive screenshots at the booth. Feel free to come and take a look.
Thank you.